Imagine stepping into India's ancient forests. The air is thick with the scent of earth and leaves, just this profound hum of life all around you.
Birds chattering, insects buzzing, sunlight filtering through trees that have stood for centuries. It really feels timeless.
Vibrant, yeah. But beneath that seemingly serene surface, there's a quiet storm brewing.
Not weather, though. We're talking about human conflict, really crucial decisions being made, especially right around now, June 18, 2025.
Right. And what we're diving into today is this really intense debate over India's no-go zones.
Yeah, and these aren't just, lines on a map. They're supposed to be critical areas, designated off-limits for big development projects.
With the whole idea being to protect fragile ecosystems, right?
Yeah.
And also the millions of people who've called these forests home for generations.
Exactly, and that's where the real tension lies. It's this powerful tug-of-war.
On one side, you've got this urgent need for conservation, preserving India's amazing biodiversity.
And on the other, these surging interests from massive corporations really keen to extract resources from those very lands.
And caught right in the middle. The forest dwellers themselves, their fundamental rights.
It's a complex web, really.
Yeah.
Law, land, and the lives of people stuck in this kind of legal limbo.
So why should you care, even if you're nowhere near these forests?
Well, that's what we want to unpack. This issue, it doesn't just impact millions in India, it potentially impacts everyone.
We're talking global environmental concerns.
Absolutely. The air we breathe, climate regulation, it's all connected. So we'll explore the roots of this, meet the key players, zoom in on some real stories.
And figure out what's truly at stake here.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this current tug-of-war, we need to go back a bit.
To the beginning.
To 2006, specifically. That's when India passed the Forest Rights Act, the FRA.
Ah, yes, the FRA. That was seen as a monumental piece of legislation, wasn't it?
It really was. A promise, basically, to finally grant land rights to millions of Adivasis India's indigenous tribes and other traditional forest dwellers.
People who've been historically sidelined. It was meant to acknowledge their ancestral homes, their sustainable way of life.
And the scale, the ambition of the FRA, it was staggering.
How big are we talking?
It aimed to cover 150 million hectares of forest land, home to over 200 million people.
Wow, 200 million.
Including 87 million from what are called scheduled tribes. That's a huge chunk of India's population directly affected.
But there's always a but, isn't there? Despite these massive goals, the implementation hasn't exactly kept pace.
Not even close. By now, June 2025, that grand vision, it's largely unfulfilled.
So what are the numbers looking like?
Only about 13% of that potential area has actually been covered.
13%? That's tiny.
It translates to just 5.2 million individual titles and a mere 0.19 million community titles. A really stark contrast between the promise and the reality.
Okay, so that brings us to these no-go zones. What exactly are they meant to be?
In simple terms, they're critical forest areas where big development projects, think mining, dams, are supposed to be strictly off-limits.
Usually through specific clearances or notifications.
Exactly. Designed to protect biodiversity and tribal rights. The idea is simple. Some areas are just too vital to exploit.
But like the FRA implementation, it hasn't been that simple in practice, has it?
Far from it. The Ministry of Environment, Forest, and Climate Change, the MoEFCC, they first identified a huge chunk, 60% of India's forests, as no-go back in 2010.
60%? That sounds significant.
It was. But that concept got watered down very quickly. By 2014, the policy was essentially abandoned.
Abandoned? So what happened?
Governments progressively opened up these forests, especially for coal mining and infrastructure.
Which makes it fascinating that no-go zones are suddenly back in the spotlight now in June 2025. Why the resurgence?
A lot of it has to do with the Supreme Court getting involved. Remember that order from February 13th, 2019?
The one about evicting forest dwellers whose FRA claims were rejected? That caused a massive outcry.
Exactly. It could have displaced something like 2 million people. Thankfully, it was paused after that huge public reaction.
But the underlying issue didn't go away.
Precisely. Unresolved land claims, the fate of these forests. It all came bubbling back up.
So now, the MoEFCC is under pressure again.
Immense pressure to reinstate these zones, but at the same time, you have really aggressive lobbying from industry giants.
Pushing hard to keep the forests open for business.
Yeah. It creates this irony, doesn't it? These no-go zones often feel more like go-go zones for corporations.
It shows how economic pressures can just override environmental policy, especially if there are loopholes or political influence.
Definitely. To really understand this drama, we need to look at the key players involved.
Okay, let's break that down. Who are the main characters here?
Well, first and foremost, the tribal communities, the forest dwellers themselves.
The true custodians, living sustainably for centuries.
Right. And they're not asking for handouts. They just want recognition of their rights to farm, fish, collect forest produce.
Without being called encroachers on their own ancestral land.
Exactly. Then you have the government.
Which has been a bit of a mixed bag in this story.
Very mixed. Bold in passing the FRA, which was revolutionary, let's be clear.
But then painfully slow in actually making it happen at the state level.
And you have to ask why. Is it just bureaucratic laziness? Or is it, pressure from powerful mining lobbies?
It's a fundamental question, really. Okay, who else?
The corporations, coal giants, dam builders. They clearly see these forests as huge, lucrative resource pools.
And the numbers back that up, right? You mentioned land diversion earlier.
Alarming numbers. In 2024 alone, 1.2 million hectares of forest land were diverted for non-forest use.
1.2 million hectares in just 1 year.
Yes, with Chhattisgarh and Odisha being prime examples, the scale and speed are quite shocking.
Okay, then there are the environmentalists.
Their role is vital, obviously, protecting India's incredible biodiversity. We're talking 7% of the world's total.
But there can be tension sometimes.
Occasionally, yes. The push for strict conservation can sometimes unintentionally clash with tribal rights. It creates these complex ethical dilemmas.
Right. And finally,
The Supreme Court, acting as the sort of crucial referee in this whole thing.
trying to balance conservation, development, justice.
Even if its rulings sometimes feel a bit open to interpretation, it's navigating a really tricky legal and social landscape.
Okay, so we've got the players, but let's connect this back to the listener. Someone might be thinking, okay, I live in a city far away. Why does this matter to me?
Well, the connection is actually very direct. India's forests are an environmental lifeline. They absorb a huge amount of carbon, about 12% of the country's emissions.
12%. That's significant. And they regulate the monsoons, too.
Absolutely vital. Monsoons are crucial for agriculture right across the subcontinent. They support livelihoods for millions.
So if these ecosystems get disrupted,
It directly impacts global air quality, water security, even food chains. It's not just a local issue.
and beyond the environment, there's the human element. The FRA isn't just about land deeds.
No, it's about restoring dignity. Justice for communities pushed to the margins for far too long.
And the pressure in 2025 is intense, isn't it?
Exceptionally high. India's population just hit 1.46 billion. That's immense pressure on resources.
Plus, you have climate change impacts, like the Indian Ocean warming faster than other oceans.
Which directly affects those monsoons that farmers and forest dwellers rely on.
And then there are India's global climate commitments.
Right, the 2070 net zero goal, COP30, is looming. How India handles forest rights and conservation is directly linked to whether it can meet those goals.
And if these rights are ignored, it could spark social conflict too.
Potentially significant conflict and instability. It's not just an environmental loss, it's a social powder keg.
Okay, let's bring this down to the ground level. Policies are one thing, but how do they affect real people?
Exactly. Let's zoom in on some of those voices.
Take Sita Munda, for example. She's a 45-year-old Gond tribal woman in Bastar, Chhattisgarh.
And she's been fighting for her land title since 2010. A long time.
Her family farms 2 hectares, just growing basic millets and vegetables.
Yeah.
But her claim was rejected. Why?
Because the Forest Department demanded proof she lived there before 2005.
Despite her ancestors being born in that very village.
Yes, it's absurd. And she talks about the daily struggle that rejection brings, the constant fear of eviction, not being able to access government schemes.
And just the indignity of being called an encroacher on land her family has looked after for generations.
And Sita's story, sadly, isn't unique. Across India, something like 44% of FRA claims get rejected.
44%? That's nearly half.
Often for really flimsy reasons, missing documents, maybe a mismatch on a GPS reading.
I heard in Odisha there are 60,000 claims just stuck in limbo.
That's right. And in Madhya Pradesh, there are documented cases of officials allegedly demanding bribes just to process applications.
Adding corruption to the delay, it's heartbreaking.
And then you have cases like the Hasdeo Aran Forest, also in Chhattisgarh.
That's a major biodiversity hotspot, isn't it? Home to around 15,000 Adivasis.
It is. But in 2023, despite huge protests and clear FRA violations, it was opened up for coal mining.
And now, by June 2025,
30,000 trees have already been felled. Locals are reporting that their vital water sources are drying up.
So the promise of development just brought dust and empty wells.
Pretty much. A real gut punch to both the environment and the people living there.
So this really begs the question,
Sure.
why is the FRA implementation so stalled? What are the main roadblocks?
Well, there are significant bureaucratic bottlenecks. It's a really complex, multi-layered process,
Involving village councils, district officials, forest departments.
each with their own hurdles. And the result. By now, 4.8 million claims are still pending, just gathering dust in offices.
4.8 million. Wow. And you mentioned the forest department earlier. There's a conflict of interest there, too.
A pretty clear one. Their main job is protecting forests, right? But the FRA gives rights, including management rights, to communities.
Which diminishes the department's traditional control over the land and its resources.
So they often resist it, especially when it comes to granting community rights.
Then there's the corporate pressure we talked about.
Undeniably. Mining, infrastructure. These projects generate huge profits. State governments are often reluctant to say no to that revenue.
You mentioned 127 coal blocks approved in 2024 alone.
Yes, and many of them are in areas protected under the FRA. The link between those approvals and the slow pace of FRA implementation seems pretty significant.
And technology causes problems, too, like the GPS mapping.
Yeah, the FRA relies heavily on it, but many remote tribal areas lack accurate surveys or even reliable connectivity.
Making it hard for villagers themselves to use tech to verify their claims. The digital divide is real.
Absolutely. And finally, there's just varying political will.
Meaning it depends on the state.
Exactly. The central government might push for the FRA, but state-level implementation is all over the place. Some states push harder, others seem to procrastinate, competing priorities, local politics. It all plays a part.
It sounds like a perfect storm of obstacles, but is there any hope? Any positive movement?
There is a glimmer, yes, especially with this MOE FCC plan to revive the no-go zones in 2025.
What did that involve?
The proposal aims to cover 40% of forests with stricter mining rules. And crucially, mandatory FRA compliance before any land is diverted.
Okay, that sounds like a potentially major step forward. Mandatory compliance is key.
It is. But there's a significant caveat.
Oh, what's the catch?
The plan allows what they call strategic projects to bypass these restrictions.
Strategic projects.
Right.
Like what? National highways?
Yeah.
Big power plants?
Exactly. And the worry is that this loophole could become so broad that it just undermines the whole policy.
Right, a loophole big enough to drive a coal truck through. That's a critical point. Meanwhile, what are the tribal groups asking for?
They're demanding more than just no-go zones. They want full FRA implementation, especially community forest rights, CFR.
CFR, what does that allow?
It empowers villages to collectively manage and benefit from their forests. But the potential here is largely untapped.
How untapped?
Only about 4% of the potential for CFR has actually been realized. That leaves 90 million hectares where communities could be managing forests.
90 million hectares. Realizing that potential could be transformative, couldn't it? For communities and ecosystems.
Hugely transformative, and we actually have success stories that show it works.
Like where?
Look at Gadchiroli in Maharashtra. By 2025, 90 villages there won CFR rights. They're now managing 180,000 hectares.
And how's that working out?
They've significantly boosted their income by sustainably selling bamboo and tendu leaves. It proves forests can thrive under local care, both economically and ecologically.
That's fantastic. Any other examples?
There's the inspiring case of Mendaleka, a Gone village. The residents actually patrol their forests to stop illegal logging.
They've earned the title Guardians of the Green.
A well-deserved title. And don't forget, the Baiga tribe in Madhya Pradesh.
What happened there?
In 2024, they won a landmark legal victory. They actually halted a dam that would have flooded their ancestral lands.
Wow. These victories really show what's possible when communities are empowered and their rights are actually upheld.
It demonstrates the power of collective action, legal advocacy. It really does work.
So when we talk about the grand stakes here, the numbers are just staggering.
They really hit hard. Think about the biodiversity. India's forests house 50,000 plant species, 1,200 bird species, 500 mammals.
Including 70% of the world's tigers.
Exactly. Losing these ecosystems isn't just sad, it's like burning down a vast, irreplaceable library of life.
And the climate role.
Critical. These forests sequester 2.5 billion tons of carbon annually. That's absolutely vital for India's 2070 net zero goal and for global climate stability.
Then there's a human cost. We're talking about millions of people.
275 million people depend directly on forests for food, fuel, income. Evicting them, it could trigger a massive migration crisis, huge social disruption.
And the land loss itself. What was that figure again?
Between 2014 and 2024, 2.1 million hectares of forest were lost to projects.
Equivalent to 3 million football fields.
Yeah, these aren't just abstract numbers, they're a stark warning. Irreversible consequences, both environmental and social.
So pulling all these threads together, this whole fight over no-go zones and forest rights, it really is a microcosm of India's biggest challenges in 2025, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's about balancing economic growth with social justice, modernity with deep-rooted tradition, short-term profit versus the long-term health of the planet.
It boils down to how a nation chooses to view its indigenous communities and its most precious ecosystems.
And the world is definitely watching this space, especially with COP30 coming up in 2025.
India's success or failure here will have global repercussions.
It really will. If India falters, it's not just a setback for these communities, but for our collective international climate commitments.
And for people like Sita Munda and millions like her, this isn't some abstract policy debate.
No, it's their home, their identity, their entire way of life is on the line.
And for all of us, maybe it's a reminder that, true progress doesn't mean paving over paradise.
Right. It challenges us, doesn't it, to think about what kind of green future we really want.
Is it a genuinely thriving natural one? Or just like a nice filter on a screen?
And how do our own choices, maybe even small ones, ripple outwards? How do they affect these vital battles for land, for rights, and ultimately for our shared climate?
Something profound to think about.